March 14, 1969, Baltimore, Maryland, Circuit Court. Thaddeus Vance turned so pale that the bailiff instinctively stepped closer. It seemed the defendant might collapse right there in the courtroom, but the man didn't fall. He stood, gripping the back of the bench with whitened knuckles, staring at the judge as though unable to believe the words being spoken. Judge Margaret Caldwell continued reading the decision in an even, dispassionate voice. Harlan Brenner sat at the plaintiff's table and didn't allow himself to smile. Not yet. Too soon. He knew Vance could file an appeal, though it had virtually no chance. 3 years of litigation, 28 hearings, 317 pages of case materials, handwriting analysis on documents from 25 years ago, witness testimony, archival records. Every document had been obtained by him personally, every piece of evidence verified 3 times over. He'd pursued this case without legal fees, without intermediaries, without connections. Only law, only documents, only patience. And now the judge was pronouncing those very words the 30-year-old attorney had been waiting for since 1966. Those same words his grandmother Constance had not lived to hear. Vance still stood there. His lawyer, a young man from a downtown firm, had already packed his briefcase and demonstratively distanced himself from his client. A professional knows when a case is definitively lost and doesn't want to be associated with defeat. But Vance stood, staring at Harlan across the courtroom. In that gaze, there was no anger, only bewilderment. Complete, absolute bewilderment of a man who had lived 25 years certain that some things in life were settled once and for all. That the past doesn't return. That the dead remain silent and the living forget. The judge finished reading. The clerk recorded something in the minutes. The bailiff opened the door, hearing adjourned. Harlan rose, carefully gathering his folders of documents. Now he could allow himself to meet Vance's eyes. And he looked. And in that gaze of the 30-year-old attorney, Thaddeus Vance probably saw something that made him blanch even further. Because in Harlan Brenner's eyes there was no triumph. There was only the cold, methodical satisfaction of a man who had completed his work. Part of his work. Because the apartment at 847 Preston Street, 3B, wasn't being returned to Brenner. It was being returned to the state. And after that, the Housing Commission would decide. And Harlan knew exactly what they would decide regarding Thaddeus Vance, now without legal grounds to the property. He knew because his former law school classmate Dorothy Keating worked at the Baltimore Housing Authority, and he'd once helped her with a difficult research paper. He knew because among the list of available units in subdivided buildings was one room at 1522 Fayette Street, Apartment 6, the very building where Constance Brenner had lived from 1944 to 1961, the same subdivided apartment where Harlan had grown up. The same room that had just been vacated after the death of the old drunk Crowley. Vance didn't know yet, but he would soon. September 1944, Baltimore, Maryland, 847 Preston Street, Apartment 3B. When someone knocked on the Brenner apartment door 3 times in rapid succession, it meant visitors weren't just casual callers. Constance opened the door to find 2 men in suits. One familiar, Thaddeus Vance, a neighbor from across the hall, personnel director at Bethlehem Steel's Sparrows Point shipyard. The other unfamiliar, carrying a briefcase, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, with the expression of someone who'd come not to discuss but to notify. "Mrs. Brenner, may we come in?" Vance was polite, even excessively polite. This was alarming. Usually he greeted her formally, tersely, as befitted neighbors in a wartime apartment building where everyone minded their own business. But now, politeness, almost sympathy in his voice. The man with the briefcase introduced himself as a representative from the Baltimore Housing Commission. He pulled out papers. Constance invited them into the kitchen, not the living room, the kitchen, because she already understood that whatever was in those papers wasn't for prying eyes. Her daughter Helen, 26, was at work at the printing plant. Her grandson Harlan, 5, was playing outside with neighborhood children. The apartment was silent except for the clock ticking on the wall. The commission representative laid documents on the table. He spoke at length, confusingly, using phrases like quote 2, quote 3, quote 4. Constance listened and didn't immediately understand. Then she understood. Their apartment, 3 bedrooms, bright, with high ceilings near downtown Baltimore, was being transferred to other citizens. They were being assigned a single room in a subdivided apartment on Fayette Street. 1 room, 140 square feet for 3 people.
But how? I have my daughter, a small grandson.
We've been registered here since 1939. This is our home. My late husband's name is on the lease. Constance felt cold inside. Not from fear, from understanding. She'd already seen how this happened. In 1942, their neighbors, the Rosenbergs, had their apartment taken exactly like this, then vanished entirely. In 1943, Dr. Goldstein from the 2nd floor, then Mrs. Lieberman. But those were Jewish families. There was at least an explanation, however terrible, for the pattern. But them? The Brenners were Protestant, working class, respectable. Her husband had died at Guadalcanal in early 1943, received a posthumous Bronze Star. Her daughter worked at an honest defense production job. Her grandson was being raised with proper American values. The commission representative continued explaining. Apparently, there was an application from citizens in need of improved housing. There was a commission decision. There was a relocation order. Everything legal, everything documented. Signatures, stamps, reference numbers. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 6, underscore, underscore, Constance asked. Vance looked her in the eyes for the first time during the conversation. And in that look, she read everything. The citizens were him. Thaddeus Vance and his family. Wife, 2 children. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the floor below, but they needed more space. And now the Brenners were being relocated. How convenient. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 7, underscore, underscore. Constance stared at the neighbor she'd greeted for 5 years, with whom she'd stood in ration lines during the worst of the war, to whom she'd lent sugar when the stores were empty. You? Vance looked away. Mrs. Brenner, nothing personal. You understand. My wife has health problems. The children need space, and you have that spare bedroom. It was a lie. Vance's wife, Loretta, worked as a secretary at the War Production Board and suffered from no illnesses. The children, a 10-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter, fit perfectly fine in 2 bedrooms. And the Brenners had no spare room. Constance lived in one. Helen and Harlan shared another. The third served as living room and dining area. But Vance talked, and the commission man nodded, and the papers lay on the table with stamps and signatures. A week later, a truck arrived. They loaded belongings. Most of the furniture had to be left behind. Nothing would fit in 140 square feet except beds and a table. Constance walked through the apartment one last time. She stood in each room, looked one final time at the tall windows, the crown molding, the hardwood floors that her husband Edwin had refinished himself in 1940. Vance stood in his apartment doorway, watching the neighbors leave. He didn't help. He just watched. And when Constance passed by, he said, "No hard feelings, Mrs. Brenner. These are difficult times." She stopped and looked at him, and said very quietly, so quietly he had to lean forward to hear, "Taking offense is a sin, but remembering isn't, and mine will remember." At 1522 Fayette Street, apartment 6, a room in a subdivided building awaited them, where 4 other families lived. 1 bathroom for everyone, shared kitchen, strange, hostile neighbors, each fighting for their stove burner like it was life itself. Helen arranged the space as best she could, a bunk bed for herself and Harlan, an iron bed for her mother, a table by the window, a wardrobe in the corner. 140 square feet for 3 people. Constance said nothing. She generally became quiet after the move. Only sometimes, when putting her grandson to bed, she told him about the apartment on Preston Street, about the high ceilings, about the big windows, about the hardwood floors, about how Grandfather Edwin refinished those floors, and about how neighbor Vance took that apartment. "Remember, Harlan," Grandmother would say. "Remember how it was. Remember who did this. Maybe when you grow up, you'll understand what to do about it." 1952, Baltimore, subdivided apartment on Fayette Street. 13-year-old Harlan Brenner had learned to live in a subdivided building according to laws not written in any textbooks. He'd learned to wake at 5 in the morning to reach the bathroom before neighbor Crowley, who otherwise occupied it for an hour. He'd learned to do homework at the kitchen table during the 20 minutes when someone else's stew wasn't boiling on the stove and the Murphy family's meatloaf wasn't sizzling. He'd learned to fall asleep to the shouting of neighbor Gladys, who every evening fought with her drinking husband. He'd learned not to react to sideways glances, to whispers, to how neighbors discuss their family. Brenners used to have a nice place, got what they deserved. Grandmother Constance aged quickly. In 8 years in that subdivided building, she transformed from a still robust woman in her early 50s into a stooped old woman with gray hair and bad legs. She rarely left the room. She sat by the window, knitting socks to sell. Her pension was small. Helen didn't earn much. They needed to help somehow. And she told her grandson stories. The same stories about the apartment on Preston Street, about Vance, about how he came with the commission man, about the papers with stamps, about how they packed their belongings. Harlan listened. At first he listened like it was a fairy tale. Happened and passed, such things occur. Then he listened more carefully. Then he started asking questions. Constance looked at her grandson with surprise. Harlan thought about this. He was 13, but he already understood much. He understood that his grandmother was right. In 1944, she couldn't have done anything. But now it was 1952. The war was long over. Laws had changed. Maybe now something could be done? "Grandma, how long do legal documents stay valid?" "What do you mean, Harlan?" "Well, those papers with which Vance took the apartment, do they still exist somewhere? In an archive, perhaps?" Constance looked at her grandson with new eyes. "I don't know, Harlan. Probably. Government agencies keep everything. Why?" "Just wondering, thinking about how justice works." Constance nodded. "Justice, Harlan, is a complicated thing. Sometimes justice happens. Sometimes it doesn't. The important thing is not to live with hatred in your heart. Hatred poisons the soul. If you want justice, seek it through law, not through hatred. Through law, not revenge." Harlan remembered those words. Through law, not revenge. Years later, he would realize that was the most important lesson his grandmother ever taught him. 1957, Baltimore. 18-year-old Harlan Brenner had just graduated high school, not with top honors, but respectably. The school counselor suggested he apply to college. "You have potential, Brenner. Good analytical mind. Ever thought about law?" Harlan had thought about it. He'd been thinking about it since he was 13. Since those conversations with his grandmother. Since the moment he realized that what happened to his family in 1944 was possibly illegal. He applied to the University of Baltimore School of Law. Got accepted. Grandmother Constance cried when she heard the news. __quote _29 __. Harlan studied intensely, not because he loved law abstractly, but because he loved it specifically. He loved property law, housing regulations, contract law, administrative procedures. He studied not just textbooks, but actual case law. He read court decisions from the 1940s. He researched wartime housing regulations. He learned how the Baltimore Housing Commission operated during the war, how decisions were made, what documentation was required, what could be challenged. His professors noticed his unusual focus. Harlan would answer. He didn't tell them the truth, didn't tell them about Preston Street, about Vance, about his grandmother's stories. This was personal. This was preparation. In 1960, Harlan graduated, passed the Maryland bar, started working at a small firm specializing in real estate law. The pay was modest, the work routine, but he was learning how the system worked, how to file motions, how to request documents from city archives, how to build a case from fragmentary evidence. Grandmother Constance watched him with pride. My Harlan, a real lawyer now, just like I always knew you'd be. In the fall of 1961, Constance fell ill. Pneumonia, the doctor said. At her age, with her health, it was serious. She lasted 3 weeks. Harlan sat by her bedside every evening after work. She was lucid until the end. On the last day, she squeezed his hand. Harlan, about Preston Street. I know you haven't forgotten. I know you've been thinking about it all these years. Yes, Grandma. Don't do anything from hatred, Harlan. Promise me. If you do something, do it through law, properly, legally, not for revenge, for justice. I promise, Grandma. Good boy, my good boy. She closed her eyes, opened them once more. And Harlan, don't let it consume your life. Don't sacrifice your happiness for old grievances. Be happy. That's what I want most. I will, Grandma. She died that night. Harlan sat by her bed until morning. Then he called the funeral home. Then he called his mother at work. Then he went home to the room on Fayette Street, sat at the table, and wrote 3 words on a piece of paper. Through law, not revenge. He taped it to the wall above his desk. It would stay there for the next 8 years. 1962 to 1965, Baltimore. Harlan began investigating, carefully, methodically, without drawing attention. He started with the Baltimore City Archives, requested Housing Commission records from 1944. They were available, dusty, yellowed, but intact. He found the file for 847 Preston Street, apartment 3B, found the relocation order for the Brenner family, found the application from Thaddeus Vance. He read every page, studied every signature, noted every date, and he began to see inconsistencies. The relocation order was dated September 8, 1944, but Vance's application was dated September 15, 1944. How could there be an order before an application? The Housing Commission minutes from September 1944 made no mention of the Brenner case. No discussion, no vote, no record. The signature on the relocation order supposedly belonged to Commission Chairman Walter Pruitt. Harlan found other documents signed by Pruitt from that period. The signatures didn't match. He kept digging, found that in 1944, Vance had worked closely with a man named Albert Dorset, who was deputy director of the Housing Commission. Found that Dorset had been investigated in 1946 for improper conduct, taking bribes, falsifying documents. The investigation was dropped due to lack of evidence, but the suspicion remained. Found that Vance and Dorset were members of the same Masonic lodge. Found that they'd been photographed together at a 1943 war bond rally. Piece by piece, the picture emerged. Vance had wanted the Brenner apartment. He'd gone to his friend Dorset. Dorset had fabricated documents, forged the chairman's signature, backdated papers. And the Brenners, ordinary people without connections or knowledge of bureaucratic procedures, had believed the official-looking papers and moved out. It was fraud. Clear, documentable fraud. But proving it 20 years later would be nearly impossible. The statute of limitations on fraud in Maryland was 3 years for civil cases. Even if Harlan could prove everything, what could he do? Criminal prosecution was out. Too much time had passed. Civil lawsuit? For what damages? The apartment was long gone, owned by Vance legally for 2 decades now. Harlan spent 3 years researching, not just the specific case, but the broader legal framework. looking for any angle, any precedent, any theory that would allow him to challenge a decades-old transfer. He found it in an obscure 1959 Maryland Court of Appeals decision, Henderson versus Metropolitan Housing Authority. The court had ruled that property transfers obtained through fraudulent official documentation could be voided regardless of time elapsed because they represented a continuing harm to the public interest in honest government administration. The case involved a similar scenario, forged housing authority paperwork, though in a different context. Harlan read that decision 17 times, memorized every argument, every citation, every turn of phrase. This was it. This was the legal foundation. But he still needed proof. Concrete, irrefutable proof that the 1944 documents were forged. In 1965, he found it. The Maryland State Archives had acquired the personal papers of Walter Pruitt, the deceased Housing Commission chairman. Among them, his personal diary from 1944. And in that diary, an entry from September 10, 1944. Quote, 42. Pruitt had refused to sign blank forms, which meant any forms with his signature that weren't recorded in official commission minutes were almost certainly forgeries. Harlan made copies of everything, built a timeline, cross-referenced documents, prepared a comprehensive evidence file. Then he waited. Waited for the right moment. Waited for the right legal strategy. Because one thing was clear. Even if he could prove the 1944 transfer was fraudulent, that didn't automatically give the apartment back to his family. The property would revert to the housing authority. He couldn't sue for personal gain. He'd never lived there as an independent adult, had no direct claim. But he could sue to void the transfer, could expose the fraud, could force Vance out of the apartment obtained through corruption. It wouldn't give Harlan a home, but it would give him justice. And there was another consideration. Harlan knew that when the housing authority reclaimed properties, they had to reallocate them according to a waiting list. And he knew who managed that list. His former classmate Dorothy, who owed him a favor. And he knew which properties were coming available, including a certain room on Fayette Street about to be vacated. It was subtle, complicated, morally ambiguous perhaps, but it was legal, entirely legal. Just like his grandmother had asked, through law, not revenge. April 1966, Baltimore. Harlan filed the lawsuit on April 12, 1966, Brenner versus Vance and Baltimore Housing Authority. The complaint alleged that the 1944 apartment transfer was procured through fraudulent documentation and should be voided as contrary to public policy. The local legal community was surprised. Most attorneys knew Harlan as a competent but unremarkable real estate lawyer. This case, taking on a 22-year-old housing transfer, alleging corruption in wartime government administration, seemed wildly ambitious. Some thought it was professional suicide. The Baltimore Sun ran a small article. Local attorney challenges wartime housing decision. The article was factual but skeptical, implying the case had little merit. Thaddeus Vance, now 62 and retired from the shipyard, hired expensive counsel. The law firm of Morrison and Whitfield took the case, 3 partners, seasoned litigators who specialized in defeating exactly this type of claim. The housing authority's attorney, a government lawyer named Philip Corrigan, initially moved to dismiss. But Judge Margaret Caldwell, a careful jurist known for thoroughness, denied the motion. And so began 3 years of litigation. Harlan Brenner worked the case like an archaeologist excavating a lost city. Every hearing was preparation for the next. Every deposition uncovered new leads. Every document request brought more evidence. He deposed Albert Dorset, now 78 and living in a nursing home. The old man's memory was conveniently foggy about 1944. I processed hundreds of housing cases during the war. Can't remember specifics about one family. But Harlan had documents, showed Dorset the relocation order with the supposedly forged signature. Do you recognize this signature as Chairman Pruitt's? Dorset squinted. Looks like his signature to me. Even though Chairman Pruitt's diary indicates he never approved this case, even though commission minutes show no record of this decision? I don't know anything about that. Do you recognize your own handwriting on the application form? Dorset looked at the form. His handwriting was distinctive, a slanted, cramped script. The application was typed, but the handwritten notes in the margin were clearly his. That could be my writing. These notes say TV approved, process immediately. Who is TV? I don't recall. Could it be Thaddeus Vance? I don't recall. But the jury, if it came to that, would recall. Would see an old bureaucrat clearly lying to cover up decades-old corruption. Harlan subpoenaed membership records from the Masonic Lodge. Proved Dorset and Vance were close associates. Proved they attended the same social events throughout the 1940s. He hired a handwriting expert who examined the signature on the relocation order and compared it to authenticated Walter Pruitt signatures. The expert's conclusion: underscore, quote, underscore, 57 underscore, underscore. He found 3 other families who'd been relocated under suspicious circumstances in 1944, all involving paperwork processed by Dorset. Built a pattern of misconduct. Vance's attorneys fought back hard. They argued the handwriting analysis was unreliable. They produced witnesses who testified to Vance's good character. They emphasized that Vance had lived in the apartment for 25 years in good faith, had maintained it, had paid rent regularly, had no reason to believe anything was improper. Even if there were irregularities in the 1944 paperwork, argued Morrison from Morrison and Whitfield, my client is an innocent purchaser who relied on official government documentation. Voiding his property rights after a quarter-century would be manifestly unjust. But Harlan had the law on his side. The Henderson precedent was clear. Fraud on the government couldn't be cured by time or good faith. The trial took 3 months. Harlan presented 17 witnesses, 43 exhibits, and hundreds of pages of documentary evidence. He worked 16-hour days, often sleeping in his office. His mother worried. Quote, 60. Quote, 61. Quote, 62. Quote, 63. On March 14, 1969, Judge Caldwell issued her ruling. The transfer was void. The apartment would revert to the Housing Authority. Thaddeus Vance stood in that courtroom and turned pale. His attorneys had warned him this might happen, but he hadn't believed it. 25 years. 25 years in that apartment. Gone. March 1969. After the verdict. 2 weeks after the verdict, Harlan received a phone call from Dorothy at the Housing Authority. Harlan, I wanted to give you a heads up. The Vance apartment is being reclaimed. He has 90 days to vacate. We're processing reassignment now. And we have to find him alternative housing. He's 65, limited income, no other property. Per regulations, we have to offer him something. What are you offering? There's a room available at 1522 Fayette, apartment 6, recently vacated. Are you aware of that property? Harlan was silent for a moment. Yes, I'm aware. I thought you might be. Listen, Harlan, I know what you're doing here. I understand why. But I need you to tell me straight. Is this about justice or revenge? Justice, Dorothy. I promised my grandmother. Through law, not revenge. Everything I've done has been legal. Everything by the book. Okay, but Harlan, this man is 65 years old. You're sending him to live in a subdivided building where he'll share a bathroom with 4 other families. Same place your family lived. That's pretty calculated. He's getting the same housing quality he forced on my family in 1944. That seems fair to me. Dorothy sighed. Fair. Okay, fair. I'll process the paperwork. But Harlan, after this, are you done? Or is there more? I'm done. This closes it. After this, I can move on. Good. Because revenge, even legal revenge, has a way of eating people up. Don't let it consume your life. I won't. I promise. 1 month later, Thaddeus Vance moved out of 847 Preston Street, apartment 3B. Harlan heard about it from a friend who lived in the building. Vance moved with minimal possessions. Most of his furniture didn't fit in the new space. He moved into 1522 Fayette Street, apartment 6, room C. The same room where Constance Brenner had lived, where Helen had raised her son, where Harlan had grown up. Harlan didn't go to watch, didn't need to see it. Knowing it happened was enough. June 1969, Baltimore. Harlan visited Vance 6 weeks after the move, not from cruelty, from curiosity. He wanted to see if the man understood what had happened, wanted to hear what Vance would say. He knocked on the door of room C. Vance opened it. The man looked older, thinner. Living in that subdivided building had aged him quickly. He stared at Harlan for a long moment, then stepped aside. __quote _78__. The room was exactly as Harlan remembered from childhood. Same dimensions, same window, same worn floorboards. But now it contained Vance's possessions. A narrow bed, a small table, one chair, a portable radio. "Didn't expect you to visit," Vance said. "Thought you'd be satisfied just knowing I'm here." "I didn't come to gloat." "Then why did you come?" Harlan thought about it. "I wanted to see if you understand why this happened." Vance sat on his bed, gestured for Harlan to take the chair. "I understand you wanted revenge for what happened to your grandmother." "Not revenge, justice." "Is there a difference?" "Yes, revenge would have been personal, illegal, maybe violent. Justice is what I did, used the legal system to correct a wrong. Everything I did was lawful. Everything was by the book." Vance laughed bitterly. "By the book. Right. You spent 3 years destroying my life, and you call it justice. You spent 25 years living in an apartment obtained through fraud. I spent 3 years proving that fraud and correcting it. That's not destroying your life. That's restoring balance." Balance. My God, Brenner, you're 30 years old. You don't know anything about balance. You know what happened in 1944? Yes, I wanted that apartment. Yes, I asked Dorset to help. But do you know why? Because my wife was pregnant with our 3rd child. Because we needed space. Because there was a war on, and everything was chaos, and if you didn't grab what you could when you could, you'd get nothing. That's what the war was like. Survival. Your grandmother, God rest her, she was a nice woman. But she had 1 daughter and 1 grandchild. We had 3 children. Who needed that space more? Harlan felt his jaw tighten. So because you needed it more, fraud was acceptable? I'm saying context matters. I'm saying you can't judge 1944 by 1969 standards. Things were different then. The law against fraud wasn't different. The requirement for honest documentation wasn't different. You broke the law, Mr. Vance. You forged government papers. You displaced a family through corruption. The fact that you rationalize it doesn't change that. Vance closed his eyes. You sound like a lawyer. I am a lawyer. No, I mean, you sound like someone who thinks law and morality are the same thing. They're not, Brenner. Sometimes the law is immoral. Sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking the law. And sometimes following the law leads to cruelty. And sometimes breaking the law is just selfishness dressed up as necessity. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Vance spoke quietly. Did you plan this? The room, I mean. Did you plan for me to end up here specifically? Harlan hesitated. Then, yes. Why? Because my grandmother lived here for 17 years. Because I grew up here. Because I wanted you to experience what you forced on us. Not to hurt you, to teach you. Teach me what? That actions have consequences, that eventually accounts come due. Vance nodded slowly. Okay, message received. You win. You're the righteous avenger. You've balanced the scales. Congratulations. I'm not trying to win or congratulate myself. I'm just trying to close a chapter. Well, you've closed it. Now what? What happens to me? You live here, same as we did. You manage, same as we managed. I'm 65 years old, Brenner. I'm not a young woman with a daughter to help. I'm alone. My wife died 2 years ago. My kids live in other states. I'm alone here. For the first time, Harlan felt something like doubt. I'm sorry about your wife. Are you? Or are you glad my suffering is complete? I'm not glad you're suffering. I'm glad the injustice was corrected. Same thing. No, not the same. Vance looked at him with tired eyes. You know what the worst part is? I understand why you did it. If someone had done to my family what I did to yours, I might have done the same. So I can't even hate you properly. I can only hate myself for being stupid enough to get caught. You didn't get caught randomly. I built that case over years, deliberately, methodically. I know. But the thing is, hundreds of men did what I did during the war. Used connections, bent rules, grabbed what they could. Most of them got away with it. I just happened to displace a family with a grandson who became a lawyer and remembered. Bad luck. Not luck. Consequences. Call it what you want. I'm still here, in this room, and you're still satisfied with yourself. So we're both where we need to be, I guess. Harlan stood. I should go. Yeah, you should. Vance didn't get up. Harlan thought about Constance, about her last words. Quote 122. He'd followed the first instruction. The second, he wasn't sure. Quote 123. Quote 124. Harlan left, didn't look back, didn't visit again. April 1973, Baltimore. Thaddeus Vance died in April 1973. Heart attack. Neighbors found him in the morning when they noticed he hadn't emerged from his room. He was lying on his bed, in that same room where the Brenners had lived for 17 years. The funeral was small. His children flew in, organized a modest service. Harlan learned about it from the newspaper obituary. He considered attending the funeral, decided against it, saw no point. Vance had received his consequences. Justice had been served. The story was over. His mother, Helen, said, Harlan, aren't you afraid? You essentially destroyed that man's life. He died in misery because of you. He died in misery because of choices he made in 1944, Mom. I just made sure those choices caught up with him. I didn't force him to commit fraud. I didn't forge those signatures. I only proved what he did and let the law take its course. But still, he was a human being. Maybe he made a bad choice, but he wasn't a murderer, and you tracked him down like an executioner. Harlan hugged his mother. Mom, I did what Grandma asked. I sought justice through law, not through hatred. I used legal means to correct an illegal act. That's not execution. That's accountability. And now I can live my life without that weight, because I kept my promise to Grandma. Helen sighed. I hope you're right. I hope it was worth it, because you spent 8 years on this. Preparation, research, trial, appeals. 8 years of your life. And what did you gain? We didn't get the apartment back. You didn't get money. Your career is fine, but not exceptional. Your personal life is empty. You're 34 and unmarried, completely focused on this case. Was it worth that sacrifice? Harlan smiled. It was worth it, Mom, because now I know that even in a system where connections and power matter, the law can still deliver justice. If you know the rules, if you're persistent, if you don't give up. That's valuable knowledge. And he genuinely believed that. The Preston Street apartment stayed with the housing authority. A young family moved in after a month. The Brenners received nothing material. But Harlan received what he wanted, justice, moral vindication, proof that the law works when properly applied. And he received something else, a reputation. The story of the young lawyer who won an impossible case against wartime corruption spread through Baltimore's legal community. Harlan was invited to speak at Bar Association events, asked to consult on difficult cases. He became known as a specialist in complex property disputes. His career advanced. In 1974, he was offered a position at a prestigious downtown firm. In 1976, he became an adjunct professor at University of Baltimore Law School, teaching property law. In 1979, he published an article in the Maryland Law Review titled, __quote, _131 __. All of it stemming from that case, from that promise to his grandmother, from 8 years of methodical, legal, proper pursuit of justice. In 1977, at a Bar Association dinner, Harlan met Patricia Donovan, an accountant who specialized in estate planning. They talked about law, about numbers, about the intersection of justice and practicality. She was smart, grounded, skeptical of grand gestures. Quote, 132, she said. Quote, 133. Quote, 134, Harlan said. Quote, 135. They married in 1978, had their first child, Emma, in 1979. Their son, Michael, came in 1981. Harlan found himself building a different kind of life, one not centered on old grievances, but on new foundations. 1985, Baltimore. Harlan Brenner is 46 years old. He's a partner at Caldwell & Associates, one of Baltimore's respected mid-sized firms, author of a book on property law, married to Patricia, father to Emma, 6, and Michael, 4. They live in a modest house in Roland Park, a neighborhood with tree-lined streets and good schools. Sometimes, when Harlan teaches his property law seminar, he tells a story. He doesn't use real names, doesn't give specific addresses, just recounts it as an example of how property law, despite its complexities, can serve justice. How historic fraud can be challenged. How persistence matters. His students listen with interest. They ask. Harlan answers. And when Harlan says those words, he thinks of grandmother Constance, thinks of her stories in that 140-square-foot room, thinks of her final instruction. __quote _ 138 __. And he knows he kept his promise. He achieved justice, not through hatred but through legal process, not through violence but through documentation and procedure. His wife Patricia sometimes asks, quote, 139 __, 140 __. Harlan answers. Patricia looks at him thoughtfully. And Harlan has found peace. Most days. Some nights, though, he dreams about that subdivided building on Fayette Street. Dreams about the room where he grew up. Dreams about Vance living there, alone, in his final years. And in those dreams, he sometimes wonders if his grandmother would truly approve. If justice really was worth what it cost, both to him and to Vance. But then he wakes up, looks at his children sleeping peacefully in their suburban home, thinks about the life he's built through legal skill and professional reputation, and decides, yes, it was worth it. Justice was served. The books were balanced. The promise was kept. On a Saturday morning in spring, Harlan takes Emma and Michael to the Baltimore Aquarium. They stand in front of the shark tank, watching the animals circle. Emma asks, Daddy, why do sharks keep swimming? Don't they get tired? They have to keep moving, Harlan explains. It's how they breathe. They can't stop. That sounds hard. It is, but it's their nature. They're built that way. Michael tugs on his sleeve. Daddy, were you built like a shark? Harlan laughs. What do you mean? Mommy says you couldn't stop working on something for a long time, like you had to keep going, like a shark. Patricia, standing nearby, smiles apologetically. He overheard us talking. Harlan crouches down to Michael's level. Harlan looks around the aquarium. Emma says decisively. Harlan agrees, and he realizes in that moment that he's telling the truth. The shark years, the relentless, single-minded pursuit of justice, are behind him. He's built something else now. A family, a career, a life that isn't defined by old wounds. That evening, after the children are in bed, Patricia asks, "Do you think about Vance anymore?" "Sometimes. Not often." "Do you think he deserved what happened to him?" Harlan considers this. "I think he deserved accountability. Whether the specific outcome was proportional, I'm less sure than I used to be." "That's progress," Patricia says. "Doubt is healthy. Certainty can be dangerous." My grandmother would have agreed with that. She always said the law should serve justice, not pride. Did it? In your case? I think so. Most days, I think so. They sit in comfortable silence. Outside, the neighborhood is quiet. Inside, their children sleep safely. This life, this ordinary, peaceful suburban life, is what Harlan built after the shark's years. It's what Constance wanted for him. Not endless pursuit, but eventual peace. And if that peace came at the cost of 8 years of methodical legal revenge against a man who wronged his family, well, Harlan has learned to live with that complexity. Justice isn't clean. It isn't simple. It doesn't deliver perfect outcomes. But it does deliver something. The knowledge that wrongs can be addressed, that the law can work, that persistence matters. And for Harlan Brenner, that knowledge, earned through years of research, litigation, and moral ambiguity, is enough. He kept his promise to his grandmother, through law, not revenge. He proved that the system, imperfect as it is, can serve justice. He demonstrated that even decades-old corruption can be challenged by someone who knows the rules and refuses to quit. And then, crucially, he stopped. He closed the chapter. He built a different life. Not the life of a shark circling endlessly, but the life of a turtle, moving forward steadily, carrying his history without being crushed by it. That's what Constance wanted. That's what Harlan achieved. And in the quiet moments, when he thinks about that subdivided room on Fayette Street, about the grandmother who raised him there, about the man who put them there, Harlan feels not triumph, not regret, but simply acceptance. Justice was served. Life moved forward. The story, for better or worse, reached its conclusion. And that has to be enough.